Is your team not performing well? Is morale low and turnover high? Are you falling further behind the competition? I'm here to help. I'm Shani Magoski, and this is the Leadershifter Show, where business strategy and culture finally meet. Explore shifts of all kinds required to build cultures of trust, engagement, and execution excellence. I promise I am not your typical boring leadership consultant, and I will help you and your team get your shift together. Hello, Leadershifters, and welcome to another episode of the Leadershifter Show with Shani. It is my pleasure to welcome today's guest, Dan Manning, who I could rave about forever. Let me give you a couple of things to entice you to listen to this conversation. Dan was a career Air Force serviceman, and by the way, thank you for your service. He spent half that 25 years as a fighter pilot and the other half as a military diplomat and speechwriter. He has parlayed all the cool experiences that he had in the military into his current career, which is as a master storyteller. And this is how he describes himself on the website, since I stalked him a little bit. I'm a story specialist. I help you build business stories that hold attention long enough to get to yes. And since Dan has such an interesting story himself, we'll explore that, as well as how he helps leaders and companies change the stories and update and upgrade their stories. So welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to it.
Great. Okay. So I can't resist 25 years in the Air Force. And folks, again, I have to consult my notes so I make sure I don't forget anything. He led the air campaign against ISIS. He negotiated hundreds of times with the Russian military to make sure they don't shoot at each other. He lived in Central Asia, where, and this makes me laugh, where making friends meant I ate more sheep brains and eyeballs than you care to remember. He was a speechwriter for the most senior officials in the Air Force, and also did some sucky work like taking out the trash, sweeping the floors. So I'm hoping that the last was the first things you did in your career, and not after being a military jet pilot and then having to sweep floors.
Well, I swept floors both at the beginning and at the end. Like, floors always get dirty.
Right. Well, I love that. You know, leaders should be humble and willing to roll up their sleeves. So that's actually really good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. So with all of that amazing, once in a lifetime kind of experience, tell us, like, at least one, if not two stories, captivating stories from your time.
Yeah. I mean, so when I look back on 25 years, I was fortunate to be in a lot of places and do a lot of interesting things and meet a lot of interesting people. Probably the stories that most stand out for me are the stories of negotiating with the Russians as I was helped lead the day-to-day air campaign against ISIS, over Iraq and Syria. So from the summer of 2016 until the summer of 2017, I was assigned to our combined air operations center in Qatar. So that's where we had 20 nations that were working together to prosecute the air campaign against ISIS. But we were also operating, very close to Russian forces, right? The Russians were also prosecuting their own, separate war in Syria. In some cases, we had shared enemies, but in other cases, we did not. But as our forces were operating close together, it can be very, very dangerous because we're not normally talking to each other. Often people aren't speaking, or almost never, are people speaking the same language, and you're operating very dangerous pieces of equipment, and you're dropping bombs. And it's important to have this dialogue set up with even people that you disagree with. So for that year, I ran that hotline. And in the beginning, we would have calls maybe twice a week, sometimes just simply to make sure that the phone still works. We would call, do you have anything? No. Do you have anything? No. And then we would hang up. But by the end, we were talking sometimes 20 times a day because our forces had moved so close to one another that we had to be in very, very close contact to make sure that we weren't employing weapons in a place that would endanger the other side, unless that's the thing that we had decided that we needed to do. And it's really thinking through those calls and the relationship that I was able to develop with the Russians on the other side of the phone, where we could still disagree on very fundamental levels about even the nature of how to conduct warfare, but we could also develop this trust that existed between military professionals who each of us had a job to do, and we were able to do that job. And fortunately, in the time that I was there was no incidents where we had any mistakes or any problems. But it was definitely an incredibly interesting time that forced me to think very differently about problem solving, even about international relations, and started to even shift my mindset a little bit about what it takes to work with someone that you disagree with on very fundamental levels.
Right. And so how did storytelling play into those kind of negotiations? Because I have to believe that it did.
So, stories are fundamental to the way humans communicate.
Yep.
Stories arrive with context. They allow you to contextualize facts in a way that makes them useful to you as you are making decisions and as you are even setting a strategy. So at a basic level, I had learned to speak Russian. I spent a year doing that as part of my time in the Air Force. I lived in Central Asia, where it was my job to be able to to speak Russian and to communicate there. So I had some language capability. I also had native Russian speakers who were there with me because the stakes are very high. We want to make sure that we don't make a mistake because I misunderstand a word or mispronounce a word as we're talking. But the story of understanding where the person on the other end of the call was coming from. Like, what is the story that they have told themselves about me, maybe in particular, or about the U.S. Air Force, or about the coalition, or about the war that we are prosecuting? Like, the way that they view that story shapes the decisions that they'll make. And by recognizing that I had a story that told me or helped to inform the way that I thought about how the Russians would act and would respond, they had a story that would inform what they expected from me. And recognizing that we both had these stories and they were partially right and partially wrong, but that helped to reveal the areas where we could negotiate, where we could have some common interests, and where we could work together.
Yeah, well, that is challenging, especially with that country. We should send you to negotiate the Ukraine and Russia. See if we can put a stop to that cluster.
It's high stakes, high consequence, lives are on the line, and you risk rolling things into a much bigger, much wider conflict where even more of that could happen. So I'm thankful to have been there at the time that I was there.
Right. Okay. So now let's talk about what you do now, which is working with leaders and organizations on storytelling, which I know is multifaceted. Start by telling us how you shifted from the military to what you do now.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was thinking about this conversation, I was thinking through all the shifts that I've made even in the past 4 years since I left the Air Force. We started. I told you that I was a fighter pilot to begin with, but my degree was in computer science. So I made this shift from computer science to flying airplanes. And then about midway through my career, I shifted to military diplomacy. I have a master's degree in international relations, and I was studying there. In fact, I was working on a PhD in international development before I realized that wasn't what I actually wanted to do with the rest of my life. So I shifted away from that. And then when I retired from the Air Force, my original plan was that I would work with startups and just help them to solve problems. I'd solved a lot of problems in my time in the military, some very difficult problems, right? Working with the Russians, building the Afghan Air Force, fighting the ISIS small drone problem. And I thought, well, certainly these startups will just want me to come in and help, have me tell them how they can solve their problem. But that doesn't work, right? Because I had no experience in that type of business. And the story that people tell themselves about someone from the military isn't one that says, you have this wide array of skills. Please come in and tell me how to do my job. It's just, that's not the way the world works. So it took me a little bit of time to learn that. But what I really started focusing on was how to teach skills of applied creativity. How I could take my experience leading teams to come up with creative solutions, combine that with the psychology and the neuroscience of how we think and how we create, to turn that into very practical things that people could do to improve their businesses or to improve their lives. I later started adding on other pieces like critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. And I built this full curriculum that actually got adopted by James Madison University as a certificate program for a while. But we also had COVID at the same time. So I wasn't able to travel around and teach that. Corporate training wasn't so much of a thing. And
I remember.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was a big deal, right?
There was a big void in my business for about 18 months that I prefer not to think about.
Right. So it was tough to do that type of work. But then even as things started getting better, nobody is saying, you know what I need in my business? I need a fighter pilot who's pretty good at creativity and also critical thinking. Like I just never came to mind for people. So about, at this point, it's probably about 18 months ago, I made an affirmative, positive, purposeful shift in my business as well. I said, I'm going to focus on one thing. I'm going to focus on one thing exclusively so that I can come to mind for people. And in fact, what I started to focus on was presentations, how to give effective presentations. And an effective presentation blends together all of those things that I have been talking about, right? It blends together critical thinking, creativity, communication, and collaboration. And as I started building that curriculum, one of the pieces of that is storytelling. So I started doing some storytelling workshops along the way, and people really liked those. And they said, well, can you just come help me in my business and just write the story for me? Like, yeah, sure. Why not? I can do that. So from that experience, I shifted into doing storytelling. And since that time, I've written about 375 stories for startup founders, for small business owners, for executives who are applying for, the next level promotion that they're trying to get to. And it works. It just works.
Right. I mean, storytelling is like innate to the human experience. And I forget who said it, but people don't remember what you said. They remember how you made them feel. Mm-hmm. And it's the elements of storytelling that people resonate with or relate to or empathize with. And those evoke the feelings that make the presentation or the encounter memorable. So I love that you're doing that and the different contexts in which you're doing it, both personal branding, it sounds like, and startup narratives, which might help them raise capital. So tell us a couple of examples of how your clients have leveraged either the stories you've written for them or stories you've helped them write or rewrite to successful business outcomes.
I take a very functional approach to storytelling. I'm not writing novels. I'm not doing movies. I'm not doing screenplays. I am helping real life people to tell real life stories to get real life outcomes. So for instance, when I work with startup founders, and this happens all the time, I'll work with them and helping them to formulate a story. Maybe it's to get a customer, maybe it's to get investment, maybe it's just to communicate their vision to their team so that they can build a team to get after those things. With my clients, I'll spend about an hour collecting the pieces that I need to be able to tell the story. And during that hour, there is no one in the world who wants to understand them more than me. Like I am deeply connected to what they're saying, and I'm asking follow-up questions of making sure that I haven't applied maybe my own story that's wrong onto what they're saying so that I can arrange it. And then at the end, typically what I can do is give them back a version of their story. And I'll write like 3-minute stories, something that's short, succinct, but you can convey a lot in 3 minutes. And what happens all the time is I'll say that story back to them and they're like, I've been trying to say that for years. How did you in 1 hour go from communicate something that I have struggled for years to be able to say, and you said it better than I've ever said it myself?
Well, part of it is they're too close to it, and part of it is you're great at it.
Well, I am pretty good at it, but most of what I do is structure, right? It's structuring your story into a way that humans can understand, that you tap back into that ancient wiring that you talked about. Humans have been telling stories for 100,000 years. So
right. And telling was the only way to pass stories down until, they started doing rock etchings.
Right. And I mean, even more to that point, like human survival depended on our ability to tell stories. Imagine if you're born and you have to learn yourself, you have to experience yourself, everything that you need to know to survive. There wouldn't be very many of us around.
Right.
But because we have stories, I can communicate something to you and you can get the benefit of my experience without having to suffer the pain that I endured to learn that lesson.
Absolutely.
There's not too much of a difference between us today and our ancestors 30,000 years ago. Like our brains are about the same size. We have about the same level of strength. The reason that we are different from them is that we have more stories. We've had more time to collect and aggregate these stories to be able to make inventions, make innovations, to learn things and to continue to develop.
Absolutely. So let's talk about how stories shape our experience in the world. While we're talking about storytelling is so key to the human experience, like not just for connection and socialization, but how we experience the world and the impact those stories have.
Yeah, it is literally everything. Some psychologists who say that every memory that we have and every piece of knowledge that we have are encoded into stories in our brains. And if you want to learn anything new, the only way that I can get something from my brain into yours is by connecting with a story that you already know. If I simply hand you a fact, or I try to communicate to you in a way where you don't have that familiarity, we're not speaking the same language, you don't have this shared experience, and I'm not finding that story that you have that I can attach my story to, one, you're probably not going to hear me because it's very like cognitively taxing to try to work out, like, what is he saying? What is he trying to communicate to me? And then two, you are not going to see the thing that I need you to see in order to invest in my business or to buy my product or to hire me for this job. Mm-hmm. Stories not only explain the past, they shape our future, because everything that we take in, we try to attach to a story. So if we go like very meta here for a second, right? I
love going meta.
Oh, good. Right. I've done several podcast interviews. So when I showed up to this interview with you, I had not had the opportunity to know you very well before that. We had not spoken, before that. So what I had to rely on for how this would go was the story of how my previous podcast interviews had gone. But I had great experiences with them. So I'm able to take that and apply it to you. And the way that I interact with you, my expectations for how this is going to happen are completely defined, not by the fact of the matter, but by these previous stories that existed for me. And it shapes like all of our decisions. We'll take in new information. I expect that you probably had this maybe with your clients where you tell them something, you mean one thing, they think that you mean something else. So what you say to them just gets crushed up into their story, and it comes out just like the last time that they heard it. And it's really hard to help them make this breakthrough to see things differently, because their old stories are just crushing up this new information into the shape that they expect.
Mm-hmm. The other thing in corporate America or any corporate landscape about stories is it's the genesis of our biases, both conscious and unconscious. So I'm curious if you've worked with companies to try and tell new stories and get people to adopt new stories and recognize that they even have stories they didn't know were wired into their cognitive landscape.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, most of the work that I do, even if it's in a group, like is on like an individual basis, right? Helping people. And in fact, when I'm teaching things like, like leadership or like, creativity, I try to create the experience in people so that they can sort of discover their own bias that they hold, so that it's easier for us to talk about it. But many, many times when I'm doing an interview with a client for a story and I'm asking them those questions to get deeper and deeper, often what happens is I'll say, yeah, you just explained that to me here, but do you recognize that it's exactly the same story, just with different events that you told me about something that happened 10 years ago? And they'll say, I never recognized that connection, but you're 100% right. I'm just replaying that same thing that I did here because maybe it worked for me there. Maybe I expected that it was going to be the same, even though the circumstances are different. And often if you can help people to see those connections and see that they're living by this story, they can start to at least consider making that change, because it shifts your thinking from this is the way I am to this is the story that I believe. Right? If I just say, this is the way that I am, well, I can't change that. That's just who I am. I'm stubborn. But if I say,
you stay stuck.
100%, right? But if I say, you know what? I live by a story that says changing my mind is a weakness. Now I can change that story, but I can't change who I am.
Right. And I bet you have to partially play therapist and coach to unpack like where that belief came from in the first place, because a lot of time that story comes from childhood, and I think you said this earlier, served them at the time for whatever reason, but carrying it forward to different contexts, it's detrimental.
Yes. I mean, I get the benefit of being able to ask people like very probing, very personal questions, and they trust me enough to share those answers with me. But I can do it from a place where I am not at all attached to what they say. I have zero judgment in the things that they choose to do, but I'm incredibly interested in why they choose to do those things. And after you've done this, for a couple hundred times, there are some human stories that emerge over and over and over again. Like one of the most common ones is someone who has been living up to someone else's expectations, doing what someone else expected them to do. And then they realize they make the shift that like, I don't want to do that thing. I don't want to be this corporate lawyer. I don't want to be a doctor. I don't want to do that. I want to do this other thing that actually fulfills me. And those become incredibly powerful for people.
So for those who don't have the benefit of working with you directly one-on-one, what advice would you give people who want to update their stories?
So the first thing that I would say is that 80% of good storytelling is structure. If you structure a story in the way that people are best tuned to receive it, they're going to receive it better. So don't complicate it, right? The core of every story is change. Every story worth telling, every story worth hearing is a story of change. Okay. So before you start telling a story, the first question you should ask is what changed? I mean, every story breaks down to things used to be this way until this thing changed and now they're that way. So even when I have a course or I'm working with clients teaching them how to build their own stories, we start there. I call that the micro story. Before you start writing the big story, define how things used to be, tell me what changed, and then say what things are like now. And when you have that core, then now you're able to, it's like the framing of a house. You know sort of the shape the house is going to be in, you know how big it's going to be, you know what you have to do to be able to complete the house. And now you start building all the details and things around that. But start there, don't overcomplicate it. It's going to be great.
Keep it simple, right?
You keep it simple so that it is easier for you to tell. More importantly, it's easier for your audience to receive, and you don't get lost as you're telling the story. You end up somewhere way over here, and that's not where you wanted to be. I'm not sure how we got here. I'm not sure why we're here, but story's over.
Right. Okay. And is there a piece, not just the content of the story, but the how to tell the story?
You mean like how to actually like deliver the story?
Yeah. Do you work with people on, because they can have written a great story or, have a great story in their mind and it doesn't come out of their mouth in the way that it's intended to land to communicate the change and be the inspiration or the catalyst or whatever the purpose of the story is.
So I'll give you 3 tips that I probably say the most often. The first is plan on telling the story, not reading the story, not memorizing the story, plan on telling the story. When I work with clients, I tell them memorize your opening line, memorize your closing line, because you need to nail those. If you nail your opening line, you're going to bring your audience in. They're ready to listen to you. It's also going to give you the confidence to keep going. And then nail your ending, like your closing line, because that's what people are going to remember. You want to make sure you bring it home with that. And then in the middle, you're telling the story. It's not going to be told exactly the same way each time. There may even be like some small pieces that you forget. Follow the structure that I use, right? You're talking about how things were. You're talking about the challenges. You're talking about the change. You resolve those challenges. You go to how things are today, but hit each of those. But there's actually some really interesting neuroscience that shows when you spontaneously tell a story, you connect better with your audience. The researcher, he's an Israeli neuroscientist, says that you actually create this neural coupling between you and your audience that doesn't happen if I am reading the story or if I'm trying to memorize the story and I get separated from it. Lean into it and deliver that story. The next thing I would say is to lean into being human, right? Don't try to be clever, be clear, be direct about the things that you are communicating so that you can get them across. And then the last one is practice the power of the pause. Slow down your speech. When you slow down your speech, your audience starts to lean in. It gives a little bit more weight, more gravitas, and use this in very precise places. The place that you most often need to use it is when you're talking about the change. When you say, I struggled, I tried all these things, they didn't work, I was frustrated, I was upset, I was ready to quit, and then something happened, right? Nobody is
the hero's journey.
Well, I mean, it's not as complicated as the hero's journey, but when you do that pause, no one is going to get up and walk out in between the pause and when you deliver that line. Like you have them,
right?
They are in, and they're going to hear what you have to say. And that change for a business owner, the change that you're talking about is usually related to the same type of change that you can create for your customer, for your client. And people want to know what changed. That's the whole point of the story. That's why we're telling stories. Like what changed? You deliver that and you've got it. People will think that you're an amazing storyteller, and you are going to be very good. You're going to be better than, at that point, probably 90% of the people on the planet.
Right. It's so true. And I think about the people who are really excellent storytellers in my life, whether they're friends, family, boyfriends, clients, like it's just so compelling. You want to talk to them. They make you laugh. They make you cry.
Yeah, right. I mean, because they are willing to share their experience with you, right? People often, the story that we tell ourselves, especially in a very professional environment, is that professionals are very serious, very stoic, very controlled, very packaged in this certain way. And when you start showing your humanity, you actually connect with people in a different way.
Right.
People who had this story of you that believed that you were stoic and standoffish and you weren't interested in them. When you start sharing your truth in a very authentic way, especially if you're telling something about yourself that might be seen in a slightly negative light. Now you're going to change it. You're going to talk about where you struggled and how you overcame it. But there's some great science from Paul Zak that shows that they actually get a shot of oxytocin in their brain that says, I should trust you. This is the type of person I should trust.
Yeah. So I facilitated a leadership retreat last week for a client. And the first thing I had them do in the opening session was present a personal artifact. And I had given them a heads up in advance that it was homework for them to figure out something that they could bring to share with their colleagues that had some personal significance. And then people took 30 seconds or a minute to share their artifacts and explain like what's so important about it. And it could be anything from something their kid painted for them to a family heirloom to, one gentleman shared about his son having cerebral palsy and how they keep track of his progress because he's like beating all of the conventional wisdom about the life of someone with CP. And at the end of it, people were just floored. I mean, these are some people who've been working together for more than 10 years. And unanimously, they were like, we didn't know these things about each other. And it created a much different vibe in the room. And, part of my goal is to hope that connectivity on a human basis lasts beyond just, the couple of days of leadership development.
Oh yeah. I mean, that is incredibly powerful. And I congratulate you for doing that. And I congratulate them for taking that risk. Like oftentimes when I lead workshops, I will start out with this sort of like almost fill in the blanks type story that people can tell. It's incredibly simple. Rather than just doing introductions where we go around the room and people say something that you forget, like literally the minute that the sound stops traveling, you're like, right. I have no idea who this is or what they do. Instead, I say, introduce yourself. Say, hi, I'm Dan. You can fill in the blank with whatever you want. I might say, I'm Dan, I'm a storyteller, but I wasn't always. I used to be a fighter pilot, military diplomat until I decided to write a different chapter of my life. So it's something that's easy for people to sort of fill in, but it gives you this context that extends beyond the context that you typically see someone. And what happens all the time is as we go around the room, people get more and more vulnerable with how they describe themselves and how they talk about that shift that they had made for themselves. They used to do this and now they do that. And they can pick whatever they want to define themselves as they go along. Even sometimes I've had people say, maybe they were the first person to do their introduction. Like, can I do mine again? like 100%, right? Let's go back and do it. And that sets a different tone for the entire session.
Uh-huh.
Because it gives you this new context. Yeah.
Yep. Great. I love all of this advice and wisdom. What are the various ways that you can serve clients and how can they contact you?
Yeah. So, I mean, LinkedIn is sort of my hub. LinkedIn is where I have built my business, where I find my clients. I publish content about storytelling. I always make it something very practical that you can use right away, almost every day there. So LinkedIn is a great place to find me. I have different packages where I work with people to help them to build their story. I deliver them sort of the finished story. We'll work together so that it's something that they want to deliver, that they are ready to say. If we don't, then I give you your money back. It's simple enough. Nobody's ever asked for their money back.
Right, I'm sure.
But I also do a community course where I teach people the skills that they need to be able to tell stories just in their own life. I've got 21 lessons that are in there, but more importantly, we have a community where people go and they put in their stories there. We help them to build them step by step. I give them feedback. Nice. The community gives them feedback. We have live sessions as well, almost like a private podcast. And it is transformative for people. People sign up because they want to be a better storyteller. But by about lesson 5 to 8, they realize that it is actually changing the way that they think about themselves, the way they think about their relationships. It is, I know this word is overblown a lot, but it is literally life-changing for many people that are in the course.
Yep. Okay, terrific. So LinkedIn is the best way to reach you. I love this idea of the community course. People can be exposed to all the tools and have that community where they can get feedback from multiple folks and support each other. I think those types of programs are just phenomenal. Super. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. This was so interesting. And I just want to recap a few things for those folks who weren't tuning in necessarily the whole time. You need to be a storyteller. Everyone listening and watching, it's fundamental to the human experience. As Dan shared with us, there's neuroscience that shows that people who tell good stories are influencing and creating trust. And they're great skill. Like, storytelling is not just something we do around the campfire or at night when we're putting kids to bed. Like, storytelling is how we make connections with other people. It's how we win business. It's how we get funding. Like, you don't just show up and gifted these things, right? You have to earn it. And storytelling is the most impactful way to make an impression on somebody, both from a messaging standpoint and a who you are as a human being standpoint. And I love the tips you gave about structure. So 80% of a good story is structure. Have your shtick, memorize the first line, memorize your closing line, and in between, you have unconscious competence about your content. When it comes out extemporaneously, it's so much more authentic. And again, people will connect more to you. Lead into being human and practice the power of the pause, which I love because so many people are comfortable with pausing, but it creates impact. Like, oh, what's next? So anything else you would add to that summary?
No, that's so good. I would love to take you around with me everywhere I go so that I can speak and then you could say, like, here's what he was really saying. I love it.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for being on the show. Leader Shifters, as always, thank you for watching and listening. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Go to theleadershiftproject.com to sign up for the Scoop newsletter and explore all the resources from this podcast in the show notes. And follow me on Instagram at The Leadership Project and LinkedIn under my name, Shani Magoski, for inspiration and content about all things leadership. Make it a great day.